Good evening, everyone, and welcome to EduTALK. EduTALK is a weekly virtual talk show created out of the need for a global learning community. And this month, we're still featuring African Diaspora series, and we're talking in this specific episode, we're focusing on intergenerational trauma. And everyone who have followed us online and watched us over the years, we have been talking about reconstructing Black history as it's supposed to be, focusing on some critical areas of history. That Black history is American history, is world history, is Caribbean history. So all of it is combined into one instead of separating. So we have on our program with us, well, Dr. Barker and myself, and he'll get to talk in a little bit, to introduce Mr. Philip Panaritis. Mr. Panaritis is no stranger to us because he has been here last Black History Month to focus on aspects of Black history and the teacher and teaching and so on and education. And so we're talking to him this evening again. And so I'm going to hand over to Dr. Barker to bring greetings, and then we'll hear from Philip and we get into our program looking at the topic that we're focusing on today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to meet Philip today. As I said, I did miss the opportunity, and my, how time flies, right? It's last year during February, this conversation was had, and I happened to not be able to join the conversation. But what I did do was listen to the exchange between both of you, and my, how enlightening that was. So I'm really excited, as much as many of our viewers are, and hearing that conversation being continued today. So anything to do with bringing a different perspective, bringing a kind of a more deep analysis of the issues that the different peoples face, but particularly Black people in the US and across the world will add something to the discourse. So really looking forward to this conversation, which I hear is going to be a brief one today. So we shall make it be packed with a lot of power. So
yes,
over to you, sir.
So Philip,
I suppose you're introducing your guest, yeah?
Yes. Welcome to EduTalk again, Philip. It's a pleasure to have you on as usual.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Yes. Yeah, when we talk about, let me go first, Dr. Barker, speeding away here. When we talk about intergenerational trauma or generational trauma relating to race, and we can tie it to, even if you look at the Holocaust and the generations have gone down from the Holocaust and what they have gone through, and their children are still carrying. And we look at Black people coming across the Atlantic and so on, and what the enslavement have caused them to in the Americas in general, Caribbean to North America. What exactly is generational trauma?
Well, it's interesting that you picked that you started talking about the Holocaust, because the research, which is fairly recent, really started in the last 20 years or so through the American Psychological Association, among other groups. The research that is the most thorough is not of discrimination in African American folks, but on the Holocaust and the families of Holocaust survivors, and isolating ones that were nearly killed versus ones that weren't, and how their families, their offspring, their sons and daughters and their grandchildren, what experiences they had. And there was definitely a correlation between, if you survived the Holocaust and you had a terrible time of it and almost died, that translated into post-traumatic stress, most often for your children and your grandchildren. So, and that could include avoiding topics, not discussing them. It could include anger. It could include numbness, as we said, avoidance. But all of those things were, so that's really, as the research is now expanding to include discrimination, racial discrimination, and persecution. The Holocaust is the model that a lot of folks are finding there's more research on. And then, of course, the other model is through the Veterans Administration, and increasingly, this the wars of Vietnam in the 60s, and in recent memory, when we were around for the first time that really trauma and PTSD is brought up as a serious subject that people are. Before that, it was there was very little attention given to it. Although we may assume that in World War II and and all of the other wars of the 19th century, that it was no less horrible for the people who were who killed someone or saw themselves and their friends wounded, and but it's only now that it's really begun to be looked at in a systematic way by scientists, particularly psychologists and those sorts of professionals. So it's funny, as a historian and a history teacher, there's so much that I needed to learn and still need to learn about the Black experience, multiple experiences. And for example, so as things come out and emerge gradually, it's just a few examples. One was there was a movie and a book, a facsimile of a book called The Green Book that came out, and a good movie about that. And so, as a white person, who traveled around the country, been to all 50 states, and when I was a kid, hitchhiking, so not doing it on a luxury hotel basis. I never knew that throughout the 20th century, the age of automobiles, that there were most places in America you needed a special book to tell you where you could spend your dollars and find a meal after having been on the and that's just who would have thunk it, I say, as a white guy. But the more that we learn, the more that the more we realize, first of all, that as white scholars and as citizens of people that teach history, that there's so much more to learn, and that the how what a small idea we have of the pain. We know, and another example is let's take the Tulsa Tulsa massacre, which has now been, there was a great HBO series about it. It's been on a variety of documentaries. The people in Tulsa, Oklahoma are doing, money has been provided to do research and to connect what happened to the people that were driven away, what happened to the people that were, just to get a grasp of how many people were murdered and lynched. And part of that is is the nomenclature that we give it. So it was called the riot.
Yeah.
It was in the period of called the Red Summers, the after World War One, and but it wasn't a riot. If it was, it was a massacre, and it was where there was no, for days, much like the draft riot in New York City and during the Civil War, there was the police had either gone over to the other side, or the ones that were brave enough to stand up and try to stop it didn't have enough weapons and enough men to do so. So, you know, it's and now, so to look at it in depth beyond the idea of, oh, a riot. So what does that mean? Oh, it means that people threw bottles and lit fires, and no, but the horror of it. So when you probe into it and see beyond and pull the curtain back and look at it as as a Black person really has to, it's so much more. There's so much more to be afraid of, and so much more to be traumatized about. You know, trauma
Yeah.
from the Greek word for a wound, and of course here we're talking about psychological and emotional
Trouble.
wounds, traumas, and it's so I learn every day how little I don't know, and
Yeah.
and it's easy to be in the
That's a
majority.
powerful,
Yeah, go ahead.
that's a powerful way to and let's I think part of this that is interesting is that you describe your life experiences through the lens of a white person and how you're beginning to see how much was happening around you, but you might not have noticed it.
Right.
The reality of it is that there is sometimes a generalization about what Black people's experience, and assume that all Black people has experienced that experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so even when people speak about Black experience, there's this kind of monolith that they create in order to explain it, which in itself creates its own problems when we begin to address even intergenerational trauma. A good example, Chimamanda Adichie, the writer, she said when she moved to America and started to study in America, her American friends, African Americans, couldn't understand why she wasn't more angry about the state of things, because she's coming in from Africa and her perspective of the experience is so different. And she couldn't understand why people were so angry, and they couldn't understand why she wasn't angry. So there's that thing about that. It's clear that there's something passed down, right?
Yeah.
So
and you know, you talk about the monolith, and that's another thing that as a white person, college educated white person teaching history, it's easy to forget about. So throughout, you know, it was in growing up and reading Time magazine and listening to the network news, and you bought into these things like the Black leader, that Martin Luther King was the Black leader. And I look back on that, what a ridiculous thing. There's no such thing as the white leader of thought or of intellectualism or of any of those things. So why should there have been a single, a monolithic Black leader? But it was just accepted. So many things that we had the privilege not to think about.
Mhm.
You know, when
Yeah.
you walk into a restaurant and a guy gives you a shade eye or a glare or something. Let's say a black man does that to me, and I don't even. I'm trying to think. Oh, how do I know this guy? And then I realize I don't know him, and I say, oh well, that's just his problem. It doesn't even occur to me that he might be doing that because of my race, because of my
Right.
skin color. Whereas if his situation was different, he would have to think of that.
Yeah.
He would have experienced,
Yeah.
he would have had life experiences where where people did give him the shade eye automatically just because of his skin color. So
That's a
yeah,
good point,
Um,
isn't it?
yeah, Philip, when you, because you're a retired director of social studies curriculum at the Department of Education in New York City, have you ever come across content relating to culturally relevant curriculum for students of color because of what they have gone through and what psychologically might have passed down to them from their parents?
I've come across it, but it's not been taught. Um, so it isn't. The curriculum is approved by the state, and so no, it's not. There's been a number of attempts to. Usually, it's something that's coalesced around Black history,
Mhm.
um, but the having gotten passed as a law in the legislature, actually teaching about it and having um, money spent on it, like to stay up on it and to go to summer conferences or, yeah, that you just don't see.
Mhm.
So, yeah, the answer is it occurs in in a teacher may do it or a small department may do it, but systemically, no.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Wow.
Yeah, to be
Um,
honest, I mean,
yeah, yeah. So the school system, it seems like it's being maintained by this philosophy of what exists before. They continue doing and continue passing down what has been targeted, so to speak. The curriculum is targeted. And so outside of that, where they would even exercise control over correcting people in general, students in general, their mental state, as it were, in some to some degree, they really need help. Some of them are angry. When I work in public school, there's very little in the curriculum as well as in the social development, the structure of the school, that they're not catering to students' needs. And because of the problems that past societal decisions cause these families and students, there is still continuing the problem, and there's no fix.
yeah,
Do you find that we're becoming better at taking care of social and psychological and emotional needs of people, or we're not there yet?
well, I think that many times, and in addition to racial discrimination and persecution,
Mm.
and that causing trauma and stress, I think that the pandemic is also a good illustration of when so many families, so many Black families, just left the city just took their kids out of school and went somewhere, and the system can't even find them.
Mm.
But what you have is that you have fixes that are many times superficial. So the system has counselors, and many of them do a great job. They have social workers, many of them do a great job, but the jobs that they do are often circumscribed by very narrow parameters. And so while they call it mental health, it isn't the sort of mental health that you would get in a leafy, affluent, mostly white suburb where people would actually have psychotherapy and have counselors. Too often, what passes for mental health is some sort of large class where where they watch videos or the teacher lectures. It often depends on, instead of psychotherapy, it depends on pharmacy. And you find that particularly in the hospitals where with the poor kids, their clothes are taken from them, and so they don't have any belts, and so they can't hurt themselves, and they come home having been plied with narcotics and antidepressants and all of these sort of things, and those are seen more and more as but really those are the things that they wouldn't give to the kids that lived in
Whereas,
Scarsdale.
yeah.
If you have mental health there, you have a much more robust and a potentially effective regimen. So we pay lip
But I
service
suppose
many times.
the people who make those decisions, though, I mean, clearly there are people who are professionals, who are trained, who, as you mentioned, are making, let's say, zip code decisions, right?
Yeah.
Certainly. And so are they making these decisions unilaterally, or are they just participants in a design?
They're more often than not participants in design, and they can feel there's room enough to do some good and feel good about what you do, but systemically the program is not just it's designed to allocate resources on the basis of zip codes, which are another way of allocating it on the basis of race and class, socioeconomic class.
Wow. Barker, you want to ask your final question? It's a wind down. This it could take us a lot. We're gonna invite you back for the last show next week, so that we can dig deeper into this. Because I'm thinking we need to move from generational trauma to systemic problems.
So let me ask my final question then. So how can we work, and I'm going to throw this to you as a historian. How can we work to create a more just and equitable society that supports the healing and well-being of Black people and communities affected by intergenerational trauma? Where should we focus in our energies?
Well, I think that one of the problems is that kids are in school less than 10, if you take off for summer vacations and weekends, they're in school less than 10% of the time. And so they come from communities and they come from families that are too often segregated. And we find talking about race, there's many teachers who, and Black teachers as well, not just white teachers, who, social studies teachers, that's what I know. I don't know much about science or English, but in social studies, they have an aversion to talk about it. And if we can't talk about it in history class, and we don't live in the same neighborhood, and we take different trains, and we don't go to the same church, and we don't know much about our cultural heritages, then how do we ever understand what it's like to, how do we ever learn about the Green Book and
Yeah.
what happened in Tulsa and the hundreds and hundreds of manifestations that are excluded and covered up. So yeah, so it's really I think that you have to look at the larger picture is that we live in and eat in and pray in a society that is de facto segregated.
Yeah, it's true.
It's very true. Philip, we're gonna continue with this. It's very much deeper than what we're thinking about here to just talk about what we're seeing is that the connection, it's a connection with the systemic problems that we focus on too. A connection between intergenerational trauma that is passed on through generations, but also the systemic problems that we maintain with gatekeepers and everybody else. Can you just very briefly, really, really quickly, talk about your project with Hunts Point burial ground that you co-founded?
Yeah. So here's a this is from 1664 when Quakers, strangely enough, one of the first white people to be abolitionists,
Yes.
went down and quote unquote bought the land from Native Americans. The reason that they made money on their estates, which really ought to have been called plantations, because we found the census records and they had over a dozen enslaved people working there for free, and they were selling all of the cider and the lumber and down to the city. In Manhattan, there was a boat that would go down every week, taking butter and milk and all of that labor was done by enslaved people. So when they were buried in, they couldn't be buried in consecrated ground in the cemetery that's still there, maintained by the city of New York for the masters. So they were buried in a side plot across the road. Well, we found a picture of that, a photograph from the early 1900s, and then nothing.
No.
And no one knew where it was. It had been more or less written out of history. So, long story short, we studied maps, we studied wills, finally, we brought in, through a kind of a trick, the government to do a ground penetrating radar survey of where we thought they were, where we thought the graves of the enslaved people were. And this would have cost $10,000. We never could afforded it, but they did it for free under the looking for something else. And sure enough, there were buried under, they had put a street in and they had graded away the top graves, but underneath them were 150 years of, so talk about writing people out of history.
Yeah.
They did that. And so working with a school that was from there, we tried to get it written back into history. And so we would find these tantalizing little things in wills and in legal briefs but it just went to show how little, like there was no church, there was no AME church that was here for them when they were enslaved. So it didn't have the marriage records and the birth records that white people did. It didn't have any property. They were deliberately kept illiterate. So there was no diaries to read, all of those things. And it just went to show, I think, how difficult it was to do history and find history about people that had been enslaved.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So, and this place is in the Bronx. If people are wondering, it's in New York in the Bronx. And yeah, so in the description, we're gonna put some links that will take you over to Philip's website that you can go and find information as well. And you can check out our other videos from 2022 Black History Month with Philip. A ton of resources you can find there as well. Thank you so much, Philip. And we're gonna have you on again next week to close off Black History Month. Barca, gotta run. Talk to you soon. And everyone, this has been EduTalk. Thank you so much for watching. And please stay tuned next week for another edition, for another episode of EduTalk. We will see you soon. Thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you, Philip, for coming in. See you soon.
Thank you. Nice meeting you,
Take
Doctor.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, we'll see you soon.
Okay, good.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.